fear is the next Sani Abacha will not send the money there because he knows that even if he escapes in the country and goes into exile, the money would be back, and therefore all this would have not been in vain. So they don't like the publicity that goes around because they still want to be a destination of choice for these illicit flows, unfortunately. But it does happen.
Of choice.
But Ibrahim makes a good point. We would be better off if we stop the flows in the first place. And I still come back to the fact is, I heard from you, it's not coming from me. It's been over the past 3 days. In all these flows, there's an accountant. Why don't we actually take this war to the criminals and stop it? Because we care. The best accountants in the continent,
They're here.
they're here. They're in the corporates. Are those shares options worth that much to you? Are they more than your motherland? Is that all what it takes to give you lovely options? I think we should be a bit more stronger than that, honestly.
Okay, I'll, for the time, allow my panelists to catch breaths, their breaths while if I can get a few questions from the audience. Before you kick off, let me just tell you an interesting story. Remember, I don't tell you concocted story, I tell you the truth. I was talking to a member of parliament of a country I won't name. He says, I was once a CEO of a parastatal company in my country. I nearly made a mistake to mention the country. I was asked to go and negotiate for a contract in another African country. He says, when I arrived there with the usual fanfare of being picked from the airport in these nice cars, and then I go to the meeting now, and I'm told, I hope you are aware, 15%. He says, this is a government contract, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not talking about government contract. 15% of what? He said 15% of the contract value will be deposited in account in a country that was named, which are also not named today. He says, I was shocked. I had never heard that thing coming from a negotiation. He says, then I said, give me a few minutes. He says, I called home. I said, Honorable Minister, I'm in trouble here. Because the parastatal is supposed to be a minister. That contract, I have been asked, we must factor in 15% of the contract value, which must be paid in a named account, in a named country. He says, the Honorable Minister says, negotiate. He says, I went back, he says, I told them, look, my minister says we're not aware of the requirement. Then they said, okay, fine. You are a government company, we're also a government body. All right? On this one alone, not the next one, because you didn't know, on this one will allow you 5%. But in the future, please know it is 15. Now, that's not the end of the story. When the down payment was made, they obliged and put the 5% where it belongs. Ladies and gentlemen, that was a magic account. When the money hit that account, there is a program already on that account that distributes it into 30 portions, starting from the president of the country right down. And this is not a concocted story. It's an existing, alive, living story. And if you were to find out about the president in question, who are not named, because he's still alive, I may have to go and talk about the institute in that country. I may just end up not coming back. So I'll leave it at that. But tell me, the complicity of the international community in the robbery of Africa, who set up that program that distributes the account, the money into various accounts? Some very intelligent software developer in that country. The whole banking system, it means from the government right down to the clerk who deals with that account. And you know, those accounts are high value. They are not dealt with by the ordinary clerk who can talk. They are dealt with by the people at very high level who can maintain secrets. Because you know, people at my age can maintain a lot of secrets. So those are the people who manage those important accounts. No leakages. How can Africa expect, back to your point, how will Africa expect to stem away the illicit flows if we don't stop them from coming out? Because obviously, the reason why that account was set up and all these things, the government and everyone else is aware. So if Africa is to arise and get to the level where it takes control of its own destiny, we better know how to do from right at the beginning and stop the flows. Yes, you had a question. Could I have the ladies with the microphone move around now? Okay, I'll start with you and then Professor Assad. I'll have about 10 minutes of questions from and then Mr. Zoa. Yes, the Prince of Anand. You start with this gentleman here. Oh, now, my dear, hello. Could you be deployed to the other end there so that you give the mic to the other gentleman? There's a gentleman that end first. Terrorists have recognized you also afterwards. Yes, fire away, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would first of all like to congratulate the panel on that very enlightening discussion you've had. I think it was passionate. I have a comment and a question. Well, I'd also like to particularly congratulate Mr. Ignatius Siho for the message you gave. Usually, coming from being an accountant, we would have expected technical statistics which speak to our minds. But I think the passion with which you delivered your speech did speak to our minds, but it also, more importantly, spoke to our hearts. And I'd like to congratulate you for that. It also makes me, as a Mauritian, particularly proud, since I also realize that you're part of the PwC family, and me being PwC as well, it makes me very, very happy. I would also like to comment on what the gentleman Afsar Ibrahim said when he commented about your problem in Africa is a weak banking sector. I don't think that's exactly what you meant, because I think what probably is the case, it's our problem in Africa, could be a weak banking sector, and maybe different countries at different levels in terms of maturity. Because the story about notes going on around physically, in Mauritius as well, okay, there's been instances, which has been spoken about in the press, whereby notes from the Federal Reserve in the US have allegedly found themselves in a safe owned by the previous Prime Minister. The inquiry is ongoing, okay, but it is not to say that this doesn't happen in Mauritius, but the institutions have worked and picked it up, and it's an ongoing case at the moment. And my question is now as follows. I have lived in Africa, I work a lot in Africa, and I think a lot of petty corruption, as Afsar Ibrahim was saying, you come to the airport, the $100 bribe being asked for, or you're driving for minor or no traffic violations, people are looking for a bribe. The labor inspector coming and checking your things and say, look, there's a non-compliance here, a $50 bribe. Many of us have been through it. But the reality is that a lot of these petty bribes, people are asking for it because they have a choice between getting the $50 and getting their ailing child proper medical care, without which they would die, okay? Or, doing the right thing, finding you $200, $300, and the child would still end up dead. I've lived that, I've seen that in Mozambique for a number of years. So my question is, don't you think that on the one hand, we are talking about ethics, which is important, and I'm making no apology for people having corrupt behaviors, but don't you believe that the source of the issue also is people will understand ethics when they are fed well, when they are housed adequately, and will have proper health. And then you start talking ethics. Because it is only then that people will think about ethics, and below that poverty line, it is instinct that would kick in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Assad?
Thank you very much. I think I have 3 quick points, but before that, I need to give an anecdote. Way back in 1979, I just completed Form 4, and there wasn't much I was doing, so I was basically loitering. And that is the time when we had a huge influx of South African refugees in Dar es Salaam. And I recall an incident where this gentleman used to come to our corner every evening around 4 or 5, and there was a bakery nearby. He couldn't speak much English, and we didn't understand English that well, but we figured out that he needed bread. And every time he came, we would volunteer to give him bread, and he would come there for about 3 weeks. And then he vanished. And then I got to understand, then the government was sorting them out, and eventually they were able to proceed with whatever they wanted to do at that time. So I completely did not understand the reaction of South Africans, the majority of the youths, because they didn't understand what Africa did for South Africans at that time. But I was able to forgive because I knew the mature South Africans were aware of what Africa sacrificed for them. And to hear Ignatius give an apology this morning was extremely grateful, and I'm very, very happy for that. But I think perhaps I would have really loved President Zuma to do that and not you, but excellent stuff. Thank you very, very much. Sadly, he didn't do that. But I think I have 3 quick points. One is, if you look at Africa, basically, it is essentially a cash economy. And if you run a cash economy, it's difficult to track anything. I know 4 days ago here, all of us came essentially with cash to pay for registration, to pay for hotels, etc., etc. The best way would have been this money to be transferred through plastic. And we didn't do plastic money, we came with actual cash. So it is going to be recorded here as inflow to Mauritius, but in terms of outflows, no record whatsoever. So that is where we start. So I think in terms of going forward, we need to encourage our governments to operate more in terms of electronic transactions rather than cash economy. Everything we do is cash, and that is not the best way of tracking transactions. I think the second quick point I want to make is in terms of mobilization of the best brains available in our countries against illicit financial flows. And how do we do that? I think we need to mobilize the competent people in terms of our professionals, but in terms of gaining new skills and competencies, and specifically I'm talking about forensic and investigative techniques, and that becomes, in my view, the bread and butter technique that all our auditors know so that they can track and sense that here is something wrong, and then proper evidence is going to be generated in that instance. And that is an area where I think we fail. We have some skills in some countries, and those skills are not shared. So perhaps we could agree that we need to share better some of these skills so that it becomes more or less mainstreamed. And all of us are aware of what to do when we hear or we have indices of fraud and corruption. The third point I wanted to make is in terms of destinations. A lot of these illicit fund flows, they end up in Europe, Switzerland, in the US, in the Ireland, Jersey, Virgin Islands, etc. And how do we know? So the issue there is information. So when it hurts the US, then it becomes an issue. And then a law comes out, FATCA, or some other law that requires banks to provide specific information to US authorities. But in our case, how do we know? We don't get to know about these fund flows. So my suggestion is, if it doesn't hurt the US and Europe, we don't get to know. How do we get to know them? I think we need to mobilize ourselves in terms of a continent such that we have a voice in the financial systems so we can know what sort of money sits in what sort of account. And if that is the case, then we're able at least to know, and then if we have to repatriate funds, we can establish mechanisms to do that. Without information, there's nothing we can do about it. So those are 3 points. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just the ground rules of how I operate, gentlemen. I direct who gets the microphone. You don't direct the ladies. Could I have all the microphone back to the ladies? I recognized Anthony here. Could I have the microphone go to him? And I recognized Sehofa, so that side. Let her microphone go to her. Let me see your hands, and I'll recognize you. Meantime, hands down, because we're about to take the answers after this set of questions.
Thank you all. I have listened attentively right from the beginning of this program. There is one thing we have refused to touch, and that was what a white man called Maslow's theory of need. We are all here well dressed. Some of us have our parents upon wine tappers, local farmers. We are actually, most of us are first generation of people who have seen civilization. And that is where that theory comes in. The way I behave now is not the way my children behave. We all started at a very low level. And until you move from one stage to the other, what we are talking about may not take place. It happened in Nigeria. There was a great activist. He was shouting, Nigeria, your leaders are corrupt, this and that and that. That was under the military rule. And when they felt this man was talking too much, they got his bank account, lumped some money into it. He stopped talking. Because he was making noise because he had nothing. By the time you have this insufficiently enough, nobody will easily bribe you. That is one aspect we must be looking at. Poverty is a function of what we are talking about. The bank we are talking about, they don't just come out and start transferring money. Somebody tells them. The leaders, the presidents and the prime ministers, have you looked at their background? Somebody from nowhere becomes the leader of a country. He has nothing. And you think he will not be corrupt? This is a factor. Another factor, population control. It happens in all parts of Africa. You see a person with about 10, 15, 20 children, and you give him a public office, he is bound to be corrupt. He needs money for their education, Medicare, housing, and if he has to rely on his salary, he cannot make it. Let me stop here so that others will contribute.
So, the lady, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As someone who comes from one of the least corrupt countries in Africa, and I'd like to believe that corruption is very low in my country, in Botswana, my passionate plea to Africa in support of my brother, Ignatius, is to ensure that Africa has a common position against corruption. And by doing that, with one voice, we in the room, it starts with us. In our little spaces, in our little employment, we are the gatekeepers. We account for the finances of the organizations that we are in. Over and above that, we hold position of leadership in our respective little spaces, and therefore we should be exemplary to others what an ethical accountant is like. And we should be exemplary to other professions, that this profession stands for something that is very noble and honorable, and poverty should never ever be used as an example, as an excuse to perpetuate this 50 years on. Otherwise, this dream of Africa rising is just a joke. Thank you.
I can see 4 hands. Just keep them down for a while. My panelists will respond to the... I believe Professor Assad made comments. I don't think we need to respond. We have taken note of your very good input in the discussion. A common thread between you and him. You had a question about poverty and its effect on corruption. Anyone can?
Let me just give
Okay.
an anecdote. I grew up in a rural area in South Africa where we looked at the time, Vixen, no electricity, no running water, nothing. A lot of the households, even at the time, had no parents. Either they in Joburg working somewhere in the mines or whatever, and the heads of the household were either children or grannies. Now you'd find there's neighbors, and then there's fruit trees, there's peaches and whatever. And as kids, we were taught that unless you are given, you never take. We would be walking from school having had no lunch. You had coffee in the morning with, I don't know how to describe it, you know, when you cook pap, at the end in the pot there's that black part that remains when you've eaten the pap. That's what you have tea with in the morning, the following day when you go to school. And then you'll wait until you come back home to see what the parents might have in store for you. And would be passing next door watching these peaches. And the tree would be full of ripe and beautiful peaches. And you'd sit and marvel and talk about it and whatever, and you'll proceed and go home. Until the granny next door will come and call you to pick up all the peaches and call the children in the village and distribute. You knew you had to wait for that day. You were hoping maybe this year I'll be the one to be called to pick the peaches up, because we always took pleasure in being the one to first touch them. That is the African morals that I grew up with and that I know. In the midst of poverty. What happened to us? Good.
I fully agree with what our friend said. I think this excuse of poverty for corruption just doesn't stand up. Africa has given the world the concept of Ubuntu. There are a lot of good people in Africa. There are high moral values everywhere you go in Africa. There's a high level of spirituality across the continent. I think there's a good foundation. I tend to believe there are more good people in Africa than corrupt people, which is only the minority. And I think if we put our act together, we should be able to win, because according to divine law, the good people always win.
Good. Anything else? Fasting has been defined as not eating when there's plenty of food. You cannot say I'm fasting when there's no food, you are starving. So if we are going to talk about corruption in the context of poverty as being excusable, then we could as well abandon Africa and go be what we want to be. But let me look at the other angle. If the 50 billion per year that is leaving Africa was in Africa, how much poverty would there be in Africa? So what we are talking about here actually is a solution even to the poverty. And so we must embrace it. I have don't put up your hand if you hadn't put when I first, no, there are four people, yes, that gentleman in a blue shirt, give me a microphone, and I had, there are three others, is it 1, 2, 3? Okay, the three guys, I'm not coming that corner yet, I'm still dealing with these corners. And can you take the microphone to that gentleman far? Behind there's a gentleman. Very far. In one of the Zambian languages, when I say far, I'm meaning here. Right behind at the back row there. Yeah, near your friend there. Yeah, okay, fine. Fire away, my brother.
Hi, my name is...
Let me make another ground law. 1 minute and your question must be off.
Okay.
Proceed. Now, starting from now.
Okay.
this is picking up on a lot of the points that some of our fellow delegates have pointed. There's a lot of good things in Africa. There's a lot of good aspects in a lot of the countries, but also there is a lot of corrupt ideas that have been bandied around. I think our colleague at the front here talked about United States of America, Europe, but a lot of time when people judge Africa, they look at Africa as one country, but in fact, there's 54 of them. Do you think that we're using the strengths of these 54 countries to tackle the weakness of these 54 countries? And do you think that the profession can encourage the idea that was bandied around, I think, quite a long time ago about a United States of Africa, so that we don't only see a United States of Africa in Star Trek, but it actually becomes a reality, so that when we talk about Africa, we're actually talking about the sum of the strengths of the 54 countries to combat the weaknesses of some of these countries that are not probably at the same level as some of the others. Thank you.
Okay, there are three gentlemen here whose hand I recognized. The mic is coming to you.
Thank you,
Brief.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, brief.
My name is Lyndon Etale, ICANN, Nigeria. My comment is brief. Yes, corruption is our problem. We are angry, Africans are angry, but let's cool it. I think the fight against corruption is not for accountants alone. Let's work with other groups. There are the engineers, there are medical doctors, there are lawyers, and politicians. Let's work with other groups to jointly fight corruption. And secondly, let us emphasize education. The chairman mentioned it. Added to education, let us emphasize in our people, inculcate the value of hard work. With hard work, most of the people who are living on maybe $1.25 a day can work themselves up and out of poverty line. Thank you.
Next, your neighbor there.
Thank you. Kofi Abedu, Ghana.
Brief, yes.
The first point I want us to
Just
look
make
at
1 point now.
is that how do we use, as a person, use $1 million? What will you do with $1 million? How much do you spend? How much do you eat? So if you steal $1 million and deprive the whole country of that $1 million, what will you use it for? The second point is that we need to use this forum as the starting point of advocacy. Good. If we finish the entire program, PAFA platform, using ACOA, and we don't put up affirmations that start the process of education, then we would have actually defeated our purpose of being here. So I think to give meaning to what we've done, I want us to use this platform today to get affirmations that will now be distributed to almost every government. And with that force, I think we'll get somewhere. Thank you.
All right, there's your neighbor there also. There he is.
My name is Kamal from Kenya. I would like just to comment that African had started rising just a few years ago when the president of Libya had decided to form a bank for Africans. So that star which had started rising was deemed by the NATO which works or which acts. That is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization assisted some Libyans to get rid of Gaddafi when he had that good dream of having an African bank whereby whatever could have been used or been funded would be within Africa, not just from the World Bank and the IMF. So in this case, what I'm saying is that if Gaddafi had been allowed to survive, these solutions we would have found them within Africa itself. Thank you.
All right, right at the yes, you got the mic. Nicholas, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this forum, and I
And
must say,
very brief now.
very brief. Ignatius, I love you for what you said, and you've got a supporter and a soldier, so lead the way, brother. On illicit capital outflows, SAIBA recently issued a discussion paper, and when we did the research, we were quite shocked to see that developing nations lose $1 trillion a year on illicit capital outflows. And then I know a lot of countries, South Africa including, is doing research on stopping base erosion, and we're focusing on the tax system. But what are we doing on the accounting and the financial statement section? We are busy with a proposal, and maybe we can get more support. When we look at IFRS, does it sufficiently address illicit capital outflows? Is there enough disclosure? When we go to the international community and we sit there with the developing and the developed nations, whose interest are we promoting? We should go with an Africa agenda when we discuss IFRS. And I want to suggest even so far that not to adopt it wholesale unless there's proper disclosure on illicit capital outflows.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, even good things come to an end. In 1 minute, Aziz. Summarize. 1 minute.
1 minute. My deep conviction is that Africa can do nothing if it doesn't get united. It's only with the continent as a whole and one that can fight against this plague. We have to convince and select maybe our leadership in a better way and convince them that their future is in Africa. It's not in the countries of the bank in which they have shared the money.
I think Africa should take its destiny in its own hands when it comes hard to make a clear statement of intent regarding what they want to tolerate, what they will not tolerate in terms of policy making. I think the statement has to come out loud and clear because it has worked in some countries, and I think this can spread across from Cape to Cairo. We should be able to get results.
Ignatius?
Chairman, what I'm asking is, who are we? Are we Africans? Are we ready to reclaim our dignity? Are we ready to reclaim our country, our economies, our continent? And if we are, we will take personal action as individuals and mobilize as far as we can around us to declare war on illicit transfers and corruption.
Ladies and gentlemen, it remains for me to thank my very able panel for their very passionate and relevant contribution. My appeal to all of you is, get annoyed, hate corruption, hate the illicit cash flows that are robbing our children of medicine in hospitals, that are making no textbooks be available in our schools, that have made education become a privilege for the few when it should have been a universal thing. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all.
Third person who I'm going to introduce along the way, and my panelists include Bothwell Nyanjeka from Zimbabwe. He's a finance director of TA Holdings Limited, and he's going to introduce what his business does thereafter. I'm also joined to my left by Koos du Toit from Namibia. He's also a finance director for Paramount Healthcare. You may know him by many other things. He's also involved in the institute, and Bothwell is also the chairman currently of the institute in Zimbabwe. So without taking a lot of ado, I want to bump into the things so that we can engage on this discussion as much as possible. So I'll start with Koos. Koos, maybe introduce us briefly to your company, Paramount, so that people can understand the context, and share with us from global perspective, African region perspective, and Namibia per se. How have you benefited from the growth, and how has that impacted the members within your own country?
Merci beaucoup, Patrick, and bonjour, Madame and Monsieur. Paramount Healthcare Group started 15 years ago in the administration of medical aid funds. So essentially a very strong administrative company. And then we expanded sideways into the provision of healthcare services. And in answering your question, Patrick, how have we enjoyed and been able to participate as a result of the growth in the Namibian economy? Windhoek has doubled in size. Our capital city has doubled in size in the last 8 years. That's urbanization. Urbanization creates a demand for services. We saw the opportunity, and coming out of the medical aid administration, we knew we had information at our disposal regarding chronic disease. In Namibia, in the capital, there was one cancer treatment facility, the State Treatment Facility. It was a monopoly. It was a monopoly simply because of the capital required to invest, to provide the radiation and the other treatments. We did some research and established that 50% of cancer treatment is radiation. The other 50% is chemotherapy. And for a relatively small investment, we could put down the necessary infrastructure. We then entered into a smart partnership with the State Oncology Center and said, you're overburdened. Share your privately funded patients, send them to us. Over the last 7 years, we've had a very good ride. We've had a 90% provision of oncology services in Namibia. Through the public-private partnership, we've increased the ability in the country to service our community. Now I need to tell you that we've just had neighbors, competitors, opening up a block away. So through the efforts of what we've been doing, and for commercial gain, ladies and gentlemen, commercial gain, we now have a third oncology center opening up with specialist oncologists. So in a sense, business brings benefit by exploring monopolies, breaking them down, and creating more competition, because the services that will be offered going forwards will be at a cheaper rate because there are more providers.
Okay, good. So we have a good understanding about your organization. And Bothwell, what about TA Holding? Can't yet. Volume. I thought we tested this. No, try now. No, not, no.
Is your green button on?
No, it's coming, sorry. Sorry, we get this right. Thought we tested this earlier. This one.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that, yeah. TA Holdings Limited is one of the oldest companies in Zimbabwe. It was formed in 1934 as tobacco auctions and was listed on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange in 1964. Over the years, the company has diversified out of tobacco completely, and we've established a number of businesses. Currently, we are a Pan-African investment company, invested in Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, South Africa, and Uganda. We believe in Africa, and our businesses are really in 3 sectors. We're in insurance, hotels, and fertilizer manufacturing. Why we ended up being in Africa was really for us as a company to diversify out of risk which comes with concentrating your operations in one country. And over the years, with all the issues that we had in Zimbabwe around hyperinflation, we've actually seen that this diversification has actually helped the company in that we've managed to maintain value. When the Zimbabwe dollar was discarded in 2008, we still had assets that were outside Zimbabwe that maintained value. And for that, we managed to deliver value for our shareholders. TA Holdings was delisted in February 2015 after it was acquired 100% by a London Stock Exchange listed company called Masawara. Masawara PLC is majority owned by a Zimbabwean who managed to raise money on the London Stock Exchange and which he used to buy out all the minorities in TA Holdings. So we've got an interesting situation where we have got a London-listed company owned by a Zimbabwean operating in 5 countries in Africa.
Okay, good. Is there something that you've benefited from that you believe people could do?
Okay, the main benefit for us being a Pan-African company has been around diversification of risk. What we found is if you're operating in one country, you've got the risk around what's going to happen if there's a devaluation of the currency in that particular country, and what happens if you come under attack from a marketing point of view. One thing that we've discovered is that in Africa, the markets are not big, they're small. And for you to survive, you must be able to establish markets in different countries in Africa. That's the only way you are able to grow. And when you're actually looking for growth, it's quite interesting. When you analyze some of the African countries that we've gone into, whilst the macros do not look great, but once you start drilling down on the numbers, you actually see that there are markets. And you can actually establish businesses there, and you can actually be viable. And that's what we found out in that. And as a result, I'll give you an example. When we went into Uganda, we got a company called Pan World Insurance Company. That company was actually under liquidation, and we actually bought it in distress. And that was 10 years ago. We've managed to resuscitate that company to the extent that it's actually operating very well, and it's actually currently number 4 in Uganda. So those are some of the opportunities that you actually get in Africa.
Good. So there are opportunities, and the opportunities that you benefited from a lot in terms of the investment. Zimbabwe, as we know, and many of us alluded to, for the last 2 decades, they are what we may term as political and economic crisis till 2009, obviously stabilized, but still things need to be alluded to along the way, which I'm considering this to be a shock, Bothwell. Yeah. From your investment point of view, how have you tried to turn this around as a finance director for your benefit, creating value for your stakeholders, and especially for the public?
Okay. Thanks, Patrick. When you look at Zimbabwe in the area during the time from 2005 to 2008, we went through hyperinflation, which basically destroyed paper money. So what we found out at the end of the day as a company was to say, if you are going to be keeping money in a country where there's hyperinflation, and you keep all your assets in monetary terms, you will lose out. What we did at that point in time was to take a deliberate decision. The first decision that we took was, first of all, to increase our investments outside Zimbabwe, to diversify the Zimbabwean risk. That's why we established more companies in Botswana, Uganda, like I mentioned, South Africa, and Zambia. The second thing is how we're going to deal with the assets that were in Zimbabwe. Because hyperinflation, what hyperinflation does is, it's like you're fighting a war. And someone comes and he puts fire on all your assets. And your aim is to make sure that when this fire is done, what assets will remain standing. Because if all the assets are ravaged, you end up without a balance sheet at the end of that. So what we did for our assets in Zimbabwe, we applied that same principle. So what we did is to reduce investments on the money market, and we invested more on the stock exchange. We invested more in properties. And on the stock exchange, what we're looking at were companies that we knew were not focused on Zimbabwe, but that were exporting. That is, we're not going to be affected by the macro environment in Zimbabwe. Companies, mining companies, we've got dually listed companies like Old Mutual, PPCs. So we were taking the Zim dollars that we're getting and investing in those investments. And what happened in 2009 when we discarded our Zimbabwe dollar and we started using the multi-currencies, that the US dollar, rand, pula, those assets still had value in US dollar terms. Those shares that we had, the companies were still surviving because they were exporting and some of them were dually listed. We still had the buildings. So when we came to drawing up our balance sheet in US dollars at that point in time, it was easier. It wasn't easy, it was easier. At least you had an asset that you could value. What happened to our paper money, money that was in the money market? That we lost value completely because there was no basis upon which you could translate those Zim dollar assets to US dollars. So up until now, they're zero. So that's how we dealt with the shocks that we experienced in Zimbabwe coming out of hyperinflation.
Good, and I understand obviously the profession has helped a lot in terms of how to account for the hyperinflation situation.
Yeah.
And ladies and gentlemen, there are many shocks, as I alluded to earlier on, and we know that has affected our region. And I've tried to pick two people who will share with us some of the shocks that they have faced in their country and how they have tried to address them, especially from the accountant's point of view. And I'll start from Kenya. And I'm calling upon my colleague Joyce Mutungi, wherever you be, just stand up so that I can bring a mic close to you. And I've requested Joyce to share with us. We've heard a lot about Al-Shabaab in Kenya. Joyce, are you around? I'm assuming he's somewhere, yeah. Just bring a mic to her, please. You've all heard about Al-Shabaab in Kenya, the detrimental impact it has caused from the human, economic point of view. And Joyce is a professional accountant at the Ministry of Tourism. And I wanted her to share with us what is the impact of Al-Shabaab in tourism in Kenya, and how can we, or her individually or as professional accountants, contribute in order to improve and change the situation for the betterment of our economies and for our citizens. So can you hand over a mic to her, please? The ladies at the back. It's taking a lot of, okay, fine.
Well, perhaps, Patrick, if I can make an observation. Occasionally, shocks are not external. And I'm referring to legislative shocks. What is the role of the CFO when regulations or legislation is brought in short order? Well, firstly, you've got to have your ears close to the ground so that if there are rumblings that new regulations are coming in, you need to be close to that regulator. You need to be engaged. Secondly, you need to have your crisis management plan. If the regulations come in as predicted, you need to know what the impact is on your business. And those businesses that react quickest are the ones that survive better. You can't change your business model before the regulation has been promulgated, but the minute it happens, you need to be ready. We faced in chemotherapy, we had a regulation change that required all medicines entering into Namibia to have specific packaging details. Now, a country with a population of 2 million is not going to convince Bayer or GlaxoSmithKline to change their packaging.
Good.
So immediately, certain medicines were not available, and our strategy was to start direct importing. But for that, you need to know the processes. So we'd set up our relationships within the Ministry of Health to issue the licenses in order to bring the medicines in to service the clients. So shocks are not necessarily always external.
Good.
They can be internal. You still need to be able to react to them as quickly as possible.
Yeah, thank you, Koos. And then now to Joyce. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick. I work for the Ministry of Tourism.
Put it a bit closer, please.
I work for the Ministry of Tourism in Kenya. So basically, I'll talk about how terrorism stroke Al-Shabaab has affected tourism in Kenya. Statistics indicate that Kenya received 275 international arrivals between January and November 2014, indicating a decline of about 20% compared to the same period in 2013. In spite of the positive tourism trajectory growth experienced in the past decade, Kenya tourism is currently experiencing considerable turbulence occasioned by internal and external challenges. The impact of deteriorating security occasioned by a series of terrorism activities since 2011 has further exposed the situation to inherent deficiencies. The country, Kenya, has continued to experience sharp decline in international arrivals due to global problem of terrorism since 1998 with the US embassy bombing. We heard of Kikabara Tourism Hotel bombing in 2002, and recently the Westgate attack, not forgetting the series of attacks that we have had in Kenya, including the Garissa University where we lost most of our students. Over the last 2 years, foreign governments of major source markets have issued travel advisories on Kenya, citing insecurity. And this has greatly affected our tourism industry and the loss of revenue, which affects our economic growth. This has not augured very well for our country, Kenya, because most of the sectors have been affected adversely, especially in employment. Unemployment has increased due to the closure of major hotels. Investors are scared to invest in Kenya. They have run away, most of them, seeing reduction in government revenues, which comes in form of taxes. Economically, it has affected Kenya such that most of the development projects have slowed down and others have not taken off. We've experienced a decrease in foreign earnings and therefore capita income. We've seen that terrorism has also affected other sectors like farming, farming where we have tourism interlinkages. Poultry farming, fishing industry has gone down. Because of those problems, the government has come up with some strategies as to how to counter terrorism in Kenya.
Just focus on the ones for the accountants mainly, not if
Okay.
possible. For time purpose.
For the accountants to address this problem, I've been thinking about it. We've not been focused on fighting terrorism, but what I have to say is that maybe with the use of integrated forensic accounting and audits in investigating and tracking terrorism activities, especially cash movements, and stopping the same in liaison with government before it happens. Through PAOs, the budget can advocate for increased or enhanced budget for security to enable purchase of equipment and training. And finally, maybe we can propose to the government, the policymakers, to put in place an insurance to compensate terror victims. This will go a long way in encouraging international tourism and investments. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Joyce. But the point that we're trying to relay here is there are shocks which are affecting us and in our different countries. The challenge comes back to each of us at an individual level and as a profession. Are we rising up to the occasion to try to come up with some solutions that can help our economies for the benefit of our people? And I think this is a challenge. And as we go through this discussion, in case any professional body or any accountants have come up with a solution to address a shock in your country, I would like to hear that tip to benefit everyone else in this conference.
If I might come there, Patrick, what I found is when something happens, there's always a risk that people generalize. I think our role as individuals and as a profession is to provide more information.
Good.
What we found for our hotel businesses, for example, when Ebola struck in Liberia, what was coming out on CNN Sky, it was Africa.
Yeah.
And we had many cancellations in Zimbabwe. Our role now comes in, whilst not forgetting that our brothers and sisters are also suffering, the issue is we must provide information. One, what are you doing as an institution to help Liberia? That's the starting point. The second one, how is it affecting Africa, and how is it affecting your country in particular? You will actually find that when you engage people with more information and it coming from the person on the ground, people are more willing to listen. The worst that we can do is to hear those news coming out on CNN and Sky, and we forget about it and not get engaged in the debate to inform people. What we ended up having to do from a Zimbabwean point of view is first of all to educate, firstly, the markets, and secondly, individual customers that were supposed to come to our hotels, so that we could reduce the risk. Because at the end of the day, what affects one country, definitely you cannot ignore, it's going to affect you. It's the way you react, what information you give out.
Good. Education and awareness, and that's something that all of us can do. We always say what globalization was in the 20th century, technology is for 21st century. And I trust if all of you are honest, what is the first thing that you look for when you wake up in the morning?
Cell phone.
Good. Would you say that? Why? We all rush to look for a cell phone which has a lot of information. And in this day and age, also technology has evolved a lot. There's tremendous change of technology. There's a lot of data that we have to go through. And I want to ask my colleagues sitting with me, how have you used technology to create value for your stakeholders in your company and benefit the members of the public?
Patrick, thank you. I think the one thing that we need to recognize, and we do as we travel around with our electronic media, is the interconnectivity.
Yeah.
We have, in terms of the cancer treatments, managed to integrate to a network of 85 oncologists throughout the world. It's a web-based interaction, so a patient is seen in Windhoek. That clinical information is shared throughout the network, and the expert opinion and guidance in terms of the diagnosis and treatment is immediately available. We're sitting in a small country in Africa, and we've got input from the rest of the globe, and that is how you provide value through your business to your community.
Okay, good. So connection.
Connectivity, and really looking at the World Wide Web as your own private library.
And TA Holding, from their profession point of view.
Yeah, I think we look at technology mainly to find out what products we can offer at a lower cost. I think there was a discussion earlier on and saying, what are we doing to help poverty in Africa? And I think one of the areas where we can actually help as accountants is developing products that are relevant for the poor so that we improve their livelihoods. I'll give you an example. We are involved in insurance. And when you look at insurance penetration in Africa, it's very low when you take out South Africa. And why is it low? It's because there's need for people to have insurance, but they cannot afford it. So the issue now is, how can you offer insurance products at an affordable cost? All of us Africans, we value funerals. Therefore, we need to make sure that we do offer a funeral policy that is affordable even to the poorest. Someone who earns $1 must be able to afford that. There's theft in our neighborhoods, and people lose their valuables. We need to make sure that we develop products that the person who has worked 5 months of his time to get his television, he loses it, he has to start again. So we need to come up to products that can protect that person.
Yeah.
And we found that technology has helped us to develop those type of products because the main cost in insurance is distribution. So if you can apply distribution models that are cost effective, you actually see that you reduce the cost of insurance. And what we've now started to do in Zimbabwe is to partner with mobile companies so that we can distribute our insurance products via mobile. So instead of someone coming to the office, meeting an agent, having to pay for the air conditioning, having to pay for the agent's car and everything,